Sun rays crown thy pine-clad hills, and summer spreads her hand, when silvern voices
the only black holes.
This presentation begins with a summary of our PhD research proposal written from 2020 to 24 and still evolving and responding to the constant changes we are experiencing in the age of COVID. Our proposal is called Building the Seventh Wave of NL Participatory Development Support Communications for Community Sustainability in Rural Newfoundland and Labrador. Our focus is an attempt to support the sustainability of NL outports while recognizing that this is not the goal of a neo-colonial provincial government which continues a 6-decade resettlement program with a relocation scheme which calls upon outports to vote 75% in favor of abandoning their communities with an award of $270,000 per household of 3. My point of view is not neutral. I do not accept economics-driven theories of the necessity of closing small communities and resettling the people. By economics-driven, I mean economism, policies and governance that make money the highest value, more important than community, human beings, or the natural environment. Instead, I adopt a sustainability-centered and socio-ecological perspective that recognizes people and communities as part of their environments, and try to support sustainability of rural NL outports and participatory democratic practice. Informed by the Australian practice of open systems theory thinking, and prompted by concern for the sustainability of rural NL communities, we are trying to solve the puzzle of why, after a rich and unique history, NL Participatory Development Support Communications projects for community sustainability have stalled, and more importantly, what together can we do about it? I draw on the Australian approach put forward by Emery and Emery as a practice of participative democracy, which was introduced to NL within the 2003 Enlarging the Circle project. Lessons learned include the effectiveness of participative democratic practice, the ability of people to collectively decide their own desirable future, and the wisdom of Indigenous knowledge systems and democratic practice as known for thousands of years. Further, to support community development and development support communications, we all must seek to be ideal-seeking and actively adapt in an era of continuous change. Noting the acknowledgement in OST of Indigenous knowledge systems, we will ally with the Flat Bay Mi'kmaq in a participatory action research partnership. The historic Mi'kmaq experience is to be wary of the centralized control of colonial and neo-colonial governance, both provincial and federal. Aside from critical analysis of Westminster-style neo-colonial governance, other similarities between OST and the Mi'kmaq experience, as expressed by Calvin White and Fred Emery, include the importance of oral methods for participatory democratic communication. In contrast, neo-colonial governance and education depend on the written word. The role of both oral and written communications will be considered, as well as how both are facilitated today through digital information communication technologies. I have been involved in participatory development communications in NL since 1989, when I was hired by the Memorial University Extension Service as a program developer to train community television volunteers to produce local programming in support of rural community development. After the demise of Extension in 1991, I formed Ryakuga, a registered not-for-profit organization, and have continued to work in the field of participatory development communications in NL since that time. In this PhD project, I will draw extensively from these experiences as well as the related literatures, both academic and Gray. The last director of Extension Services pointed to the, quote, the usual politics of a university where some faculty regarded the application of non-formal learning to community problem solving as inappropriate for an institution of higher learning. In this project, non-formal approaches to community and lifelong learning will be acknowledged as equal to formal education. No hierarchies. Transdisciplinary scan summary. It would seem logical that decades of experience in Newfoundland and Labrador as a practitioner of community development and adult education would be the ideal preparation for entry into a program of transdisciplinary sustainability. I'd add my arguments are supported by transdisciplinary literature as quoted in this summary. One might say the main ingredients of transdisciplinary are working from a variety of disciplines, interdisciplinary and more, and university people working with people from outside the university as equals. Since 1989, I have worked on more than 100 communication projects in more than 60 rural NL communities. I first recall meeting Calvin White, now a TRSU mentor or advisor, when he led the Citizens Advisory Council while I was regional planner with the Provincial Rural Secretariat. His local knowledge, practical experience, and wisdom are impressive, and I have interviewed him several times for YouTube and podcast. Calvin is a perfect match for TRSU because of his transdisciplinary sustainability approach to NL Mi'kmaq, especially Flat Bay, but also because he includes rural NL communities in his analysis and practice. He generously includes me as an ally in a participatory action research process. I would suggest that our collaborations have endured because they are, quote, based on effective communication, transparency in decision-making, mutual respect, and trust. The concept of sustainable development achieved worldwide prominence with the publication of the UN Brundtland Report in 1987. The report stressed meeting the needs of future generations. This is, of course, compatible with the indigenous concept of 7 generations. Thinking 7 generations ahead is necessary for protecting the natural environment and contrasts with the Western democratic politicians who can only plan for the next 4 years. Calvin believes that European settlers to Newfoundland adopted the traditional Mi'kmaq subsistence living style when they created remote villages on the shores. Calvin is supportive of the Mi'kmaq relationship with Grenfell College, and he has talked to me about two-eyed seeing, a concept developed by Albert Marshall and others at Cape Breton University. It recognizes the environmental wisdom of Mi'kmaq practice and suggests that it's possible to join Mi'kmaq and academic knowledge. A major learning for me in the TRSU program was when advisor Barbara Barter introduced me to adult education, emancipatory theory, and critical theory. The initial question in our research proposal to analyze why each wave of support for NL participatory development support communications from 1979 to 2016 was terminated made sense after reading critical theorists. My argument is that shutting down outports for economic reasons is immoral and the cause of mental anguish and trauma. It's a quote from Blake, 2023. For example, Steinberg and Kincheloe argue, quote, critical theory, if nothing else, is a moral construct designed to reduce human suffering in the world. In the critical theoretical context, every individual is granted dignity regardless of his or her location in the web of reality. Thus, the continuation of human suffering by conscious human decision is morally unacceptable behavior that must be analyzed, interpreted, and changed. And further, contemporary critical theory argues that so-called democratic society is not as democratic as generally believed. Democratic citizens are regulated by the forces of power operating in a general climate of deceit. In this contemporary condition, individuals and schools are acculturated and schooled to feel comfortable in relations of domination or subordination rather than equality or interdependence. There are alternatives to resettling rural communities. According to Daguerre, formerly of Concordia University and Mohawk scholar Deering, quote, open systems theory, as primarily developed by Fred and Marilyn Emery in Australia, provides an integrated set of concepts and constructs in both theory and practice to describe reality more accurately. A major part of the work is to research participative democratic structures, processes, and governance as an alternative to dominant hierarchies. End quote. E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered, questions the socio-economic system that dominates our lives. By the mid-70s, when he wrote, it had become apparent that unbridled capitalism was not only detrimentally affecting the lives of the majority of the world's population, but also destroying the planet itself. Schumacher writes of, quote, the idolatry of economism, a Russian term used by Lenin to describe socio-economic systems where only money matters. Neil Tilley, a friend and former Munn Extension field worker, once told me he was on a rural wharf talking to an old guy about the economy, and he was told the problem is greed, simply human greed. Mebartu writes the same thing. As eco-socialism argues, sustainability sound capitalist development is a contradiction in terms. Fred Gale seems to agree, quote, once again, grotesque levels of domestic and international inequality dog capitalism, dramatized in Oxfam's claim that, quote, just 62 individuals had the same wealth as 3.6 billion people, the bottom half of humanity. Gale reminds us about the fact, quote, the fact that Homo sapiens has spent most of its life living in small autonomous groups, endorses a more localized subsistence form of provisioning using appropriate technologies via frequent and multifaceted face-to-face interactions, end of quote. This view would seem to support my view that rural, interdependent outports are ideal communities. But Wiseman asks, quote, whether it, transdisciplinary, will ever reach the format of an established discipline is questionable, since transdisciplinarity addresses boundaries between forms of knowledge, taking into account the diversity, complexity, uncertainty, and value of issues. Wolf and Erstrom suggest, quote, we need strong utopias as guiding principles.
We are talking about grassroots, participatory community radio. Typically, we work with community groups on special events which focus on discussion of local issues and cultural celebration. Basic principle of participatory communications, ordinary people have the right to be heard, but also the responsibility to speak out, say something. For each communication project, we look for as many partners as possible. There were almost 30 partners in Sharing Our Future. Always, in looking for partners, we emphasize commonalities rather than differences. In the communities, we work with people of all ages and all walks of life. Our community media project, Animators or Encouragers, have included women at home, retired teachers, and recent university graduates. The local musicians, who are so important in our community events, are not merely entertainers. They create an environment in which people feel good about their culture, who they are. Local people can speak out and plan their own future when they feel pride in themselves. Mainstream media tend to make people who live away from big centers feel inferior and insecure. We try to stress the positive aspects of local environment and its culture. This is also known as pride of place. Again, we want people to feel good about themselves and speak out. Ben and Friends is one of the most popular programs on VOBB, the Voice of Bombay. A Caribbean Federation of Youth slogan says, "Youth are the present answer to the future." Youth are essential in our media projects. They are not afraid of technology. Their energy catalyzes the process. An intergenerational mix is good. Older people gain respect for the technical powers of youth, while younger people become interested in community issues. We are talking about public space, participatory, interactive radio.
Topic title: Education and Communication for Rural Community Sustainability. I first heard of the FOGO process from Neil Tilley in the 1980s when he was trying to recruit me to come work for the university's extension service. At first I was an apostle, then I swung to Extension Associate Director Dave Curran's point of view that it was actually a myth, which I repeated in conferences and even on community radio on Fogo Island itself. But after reading essays, books, and interviews in the past 6 months, I have changed my mind again. I now believe that Donald Snowden began the practice of participatory development support communications, PDSC, before it was named in the literature. In this essay, we are equating the FOGO process and PDSC. But it is complicated. I'm not suggesting that the FOGO process film saved the people of the island from resettlement. I therefore disagree with the National Film Board and Shorefast and side with local author Roy Dwyer, his wedding was actually a NFB film, that it was the Fisheries Co-op that should have the credit. Snowden, with experience facilitating cooperatives among the Inuit, came to Newfoundland in 1964, as he said, working for the Cooperative Union of Canada to work with producer cooperatives, and he became Director of Extension in 1966. Although Director of the Memorial University Extension Service, Extension, for 7 years, Donald Snowden did not consider himself an academic, nor even of the university. I never met Snowden, but I have discussed the man with Elaine Harris, who was the last Director of Extension and early on his executive assistant. Though a graduate journalist, Snowden was a practitioner and wrote little, so the best source of his thought is an interview and also a presentation to the Canadian Association for Adult Education. It would seem from the beginning there was a divide between Extension and MUN academics. According to Snowden, in his interview with Wendy Quarry in 1984, the academic university was notable for its absence or lack of interest. He explained the divide to the CASAE presentation. I think there is a hostility and resentment towards such community-based research because of the tradition of one-way extraction and of totally inadequate communication on the part of researchers with local people. Continues, I see too in my own institution of the conviction on the part some academics have that research conducted by a non-academic or a non-professional is of little or no value. That's not just common to my institution, MUN. It's common throughout this country, and it's a global impediment to participatory research. To date, the only so-called academic peer-reviewed study of MUN Extension has been written by MUN history teacher Jeff Webb, who basically claims that Extension did nothing after 1969. Snowden's colleague, Tony Williamson, who initiated the Don Snowden Center for Development Support Communication after Snowden's death in India, and Tony later transferred the center to UGuelph, and Williamson and Snowden were specific in their direction of what Extension was trying to do in rural NL. Quote, Community development is essentially an educational process. The basic tenet of community development is involvement of local people in identification and solution of their own problems. And further, hence it is clear that the university extension representatives are engaged in community development and adult education in the fullest sense. It can be seen the university extension worker is not task-oriented. He can work with greater flexibility because he's not under directives. He is primarily an adult educator and coordinator concerned with the processes which enable the individuals of the community to develop, to choose their own priorities and tasks, to be self-determined. And further, practitioners of the FOGO process, on the other hand, see development support communications as a tool in participatory action research or participatory development. Although the FOGO process is concentrated on film and video, other media can be involved, such as popular theater or puppetry. All can be powerful means for involving people in a process which enhances self-awareness, self-confidence, and self-empowerment through objective reflection, consensus, community action, structural change, and participation in development, which improves the quality of life for those who engage it. I'm thinking that when Snowden and Tony Williamson described the extension field worker / adult educator, they are also describing the way Snowden worked as a practitioner with what Bruce Gilbert calls a community development ethic. In other words, they weren't working from engagement rules in a textbook, but rather from a flexible attitude and a respect for local ways of doing things. That's Bev Kirby's definition of culture. One might say the divide between extension and non-academics began at St. Francis Xavier in the 1930s and 20s with the concept of for the people. In 1920, Father Jimmy Tompkins wrote a manifesto exhorting St. Francis Xavier University to focus on education and training for the people, and he attacked the concept of the university serving only an elite group seeking professional careers. Supported by Father Moses Cody, by 1930, St. FX had established a Department of Extension, also known as a Department of Social Action, with the, quote, social vision of a cooperative society and programs for fishermen, miners, lumbermen, and ordinary people. In 1933, the Newfoundland Commission of Government requested support, and St. FX sent a team of 5, who, according to Cody, in 5 years established 600 study clubs, 26 credit unions, 25 buying clubs, and 10 other cooperatives. This was the time of the Depression, and Cody had no illusion of the nature of, quote, the modern democracy. Quote, our people in a modern democracy have little liberty left under the dictatorship of big business and finance. It's interesting that MUN Extension was initiated in 1959, a year of economic depression in Newfoundland. 19.2% were unemployed, and 1/2 the labor force was on welfare, the worst since the 1930s. In trying to analyze the history of Newfoundland and Labrador Extension, Snowden-style participatory development support communications, it's obvious we are moving from a 60s culture of freedom, equality, and people's rights to the present age of COVID, which is still evolving, but definitely a time of conflict, and, in open systems theory language, a time of, quote, tumultuous change. It's also obvious that we, as described in the project summary, currently have no effective champions for participatory communications to support the sustainability of NL outports in a province whose premier extols neo-colonial Westminster governance. It would seem that in 2024, challenges of funding and champions are less significant than a need for autonomy and self-governance. This point of view would seem to be supported by this week's protest of the people, fishers and plant workers at the Confederation Building. Topic title: Education and Communication for Rural Community Sustainability. Discussion and implementation of digital communication in Newfoundland and Labrador began on a positive note in the 1980s with the support of the Economic Recovery Commission, ERC, and Richard Fuchs. The vision was for the Internet to bring a new age of positive development to rural NL. The Economic Recovery Commission, in practice, tried to carry out a future-looking positive vision for the outports. Richard Fuchs, later an ERC executive director, advised the Royal Commission of 1986, quote, "A concerted effort needs to be made to transfer these technologies to rural residents in order that they become computer literate in their interaction with the urban sector. Government would be well advised to begin the transfer of this technology through the structure of rural development associations and local governments as a component of both its new policy of post-secondary educational decentralization and its long-standing of rural development. Put simply, if rural areas are able to negotiate and influence public policy in the service sector, they will need an information network among themselves which makes decisions affecting their lives. If the revolution in computer technology is to be interactive rather than extractive, the rural resident seated in front of the video monitor will have to know the language of the exchange." For a short period, NL seemed about to lead the world in the adoption of community computer networks. ERC, working through the Newfoundland and Labrador Development Corporation, quote, "initiated the establishment of the Enterprise Network, an electronic information and telecommunications support system that would begin to realize the Commission's vision of electronic villages in rural Newfoundland and Labrador." Fuchs took a leading role, and rural telecenters were established across the province, later to be accompanied by the nationwide Community Access Program. The Enterprise Network was Canada's first rural online service and introduced North America's first rural telecenters. The Enterprise Network offered two essential rural informatics services: a non-line dial-up electronic information and communication service, and a system of 6 rural telecenters. Began in 1989. However, in a neo-colonial governance system, the ERC call for participation and decentralized decision-making could perhaps be described as an Achilles heel. Doug House is a MUN prof and head of the ERC, quote, "A historic weakness of Newfoundland and Labrador society has been its underdeveloped municipal level of government and overdependence on state officials, whether from Great Britain, mainland Canada, or the city of St. John's. The Royal Commission argued strongly for greater decentralization of political and economic decision-making from both the federal and provincial governments to community and regional organizations, and greater decentralization within government agencies and departments themselves. This would be central to reducing dependency on government and achieving greater self-reliance," end of quote. In the late 90s zeitgeist, our West Coast collaboration, Sharing Our Future, Partager Notre Avenir, through the Office of Learning Technologies, became a participant in global congresses on community networking. It was a positive area, with individuals and groups from around the world meeting together, convinced it was possible to have a digital future for the people. There were 3 congresses in Barcelona, Buenos Aires, and Montreal, but it's gone. The last maybe was 2003, and I see no indication of it happening. And a few weeks ago, Telecommunities Canada directors, and I'm one, we were called to respond to a questionnaire from the United Nations, a questionnaire which was for a review of the World Summit on the Information Society. And I agree with what we told the UN. Quote, "Over the past 20 years, we suggest the information society envisioned has actually moved away from a people-centered, inclusive, development-oriented society towards a corporate-centered, profit-oriented society. The information society is still about people, but in the shift from people in a community context to people in a market context, we have allowed market values to drive human values, leaving out a broad spectrum of human values that exist in communities. There's an urgent need to move to a more balanced society in which communities represent the organizational capacity, identity, and form that can countervail some of the impacts of market-driven policies. Further, digital equity is a goal that remains elusive in the information society. Access, affordability, usability, local support, education program, all these things are needed to be a participating citizen in the 21st century. They're improved from even 5 years ago, but we know the job is far from completed and that digital equity needs to head any future list of priorities. And further, fundamentally, this is about fairness, the ability for everyone to participate in the benefits the internet can offer. The corporate market-centered society is focused on profitability, not fairness. This is a public policy issue that requires immediate attention and investment. Citizens and governments at all levels must prioritize social values in the information society. And finally, from 2020 to 2022, the world was responding to the pandemic using the tools that enabled them to communicate and grow, and these new patterns have become part of daily life around the world. The internet has become, more than ever before, an essential tool for participation in the public and private lives of citizens around the world. As a Telecommunities Canada Director, I agree with the content of the questionnaire to the UN Commission. It also reflects my experience in rural NL. The expertise exists in rural NL to create positive change, as demonstrated by, at the time, community-owned Burgeo broadcasting system and its creation of a long-range wireless internet system to connect outports on the southwest coast. The motivation was not profit for corporations, but rather improved healthcare and education. So again, our challenge is governance, ownership, and local control. It might seem a major effort to challenge the double helix of major capitalist corporations and a supporting neo-colonial provincial government, which actually advocates relocation of rural communities. But a transdisciplinary approach to transformation should be an encouragement. When I asked Calvin what I considered as the battle with the federal government, which was over Trudeau's white paper in 1969, he actually said it was an awakening for Indigenous people across the country. Is it not possible to vision a similar awakening in Newfoundland and Labrador to guarantee the sustainability of rural outports? So what next? 1. During this event, we can discuss the possibility of Grenfell Campus joining the First Mile Consortium. 2. Calvin has offered to facilitate a face-to-face Southwest Newfoundland participatory community dialogue. 3. Governance interviews across the province, including Mi'kmaq self-governance. 4. Digital surveys of internet and mobiles in Western Newfoundland to have information now. 5. Participatory evaluation of the project. 6. Hybrid e-portfolio. And 7. I would like to research the archives and get them established. Anyway, thank you.